This week in the Regency, we're continuing our series on coaches or means of transportation. And this week, it's all about the curricle. We've all read Georgette Heyer with curricle races and curricle accidents and people being allowed to go for a drive with a gentleman in a curricle because it was an open carriage and therefore one didn't need a chaperone. So what is a curricle? Well, it's a two-wheeled vehicle. There are basically three kinds of two-wheeled vehicles. There are gigs, there are curricles, and there are whiskey curricles or whiskey gigs. The main difference between a gig and a curricle, the bodies are pretty much the same. The main difference is that a gig has one horse and a curricle has two. So here is a chair-backed gig from our friend William Felton from his treatise on carriages. He was a carriage maker. And you can see that this has shafts. They're actually, we can't see them because they're even, but there's two shafts there and the horse went between them. In a curricle where there were two horses, you see there's a pole and the horses go either side of that pole connected to the T junction that you can see on the image. The chair-backed gig has a higher back than the curricle, and that made the curricle light. So the great thing about it being light was that it could go fast. And because you had two horses instead of one, it could go fast. When we look at William Felton's, what do you get from the basic price? You get the body, a step piece with sham doors, which is quite nice, and a sword case lined with second cloth. That is, you know, if you wanted really nice cloth like velvet, you had to go up a level, trimmed with 2-inch lace, very specific on that, a pair of wings with plated frames and a middle-sized knee boot. And if we go back, we can see that the knee boot is the bit at the back where the groom, or as they're often called, the tiger. And this is where the tendency to have young grooms or tigers came, because the curricle was, the whole point of a curricle was to have it be light. And so putting a really heavy, big adult man on the back kind of defeated that purpose. My favorite bit in Felton here is where he talks about like the fancy versions of curricles. And he says, the proprietors of this sort of carriage are in general persons of high repute for fashion, and who are continually of themselves inventing some improvements, the variety of which would be too tedious to relate. Those only will be noticed which are best calculated for ease and safety. So you just know that this poor man has, you know, every time a young buck orders a curricle from him, the guy has some idea, some new idea about how we can make it go faster, how we can make it be lighter, you know, and he's just like having to put up with it because they're the customers. So how much did they cost for the straight gig? It cost you £31, 14 shillings and 6pence for the basic model. But if you wanted all the extras, it was £57, 5 shillings and 6pence. And similarly for a gig curricle is one where you can change it over. That's £36, 3 shillings, or with all the extras, £54, 1 shilling and 6pence. Now, remember that price, because it becomes relevant to our March story. But before we go on to the story, I want to just remind people one element of having a curricle and why you needed to be a Corinthian, a good driver, in order to use one safely. So curricles were very light. Not as light as a contemporary sulky, but much lighter than other carriages. And that meant that they were more prone to falling over, but also they had 2 horses. And it was a skill to drive tandem. This is a cartoon that was done in 1825, showing a novice whip getting it all wrong. It's called Learning to Drive Tandem. And there were also all sorts of problems with matching the horses, because in a curricle they had to be matched exactly. Because it was so light, any difference between their gait or their size was really emphasized and caused an accident. And in fact, when I went to look for curricles in March in 1816, I found lots of accidents of curricles, including one from a House of Lords where the groom, after having dropped his master off at the house, tried to turn in the street and overturned the curricle, which must have been very embarrassing for him. Curricles were very fashionable, and they were therefore expensive. So when I went to look for a story about a curricle in March, what I found was a story of theft. John Deere and John, now it says Tregent here, but in fact they got that wrong. His name was Trudgett. 2 horse dealers are committed to Newgate for trial on charge of stealing a curricle from Tattersall's repository, the property of Mr. G. Steele of Holborn. Now, they worked for him, or by the time this happened, John Deere had stopped working for him, but John Trudgett was still working for him. The same horse dealers are remanded on another charge of being likewise horse dealers, and that by taking 2 horses from Bushy Park, also belonging to Mr. Steele. So I went looking for the records. I went looking to the Old Bailey records, because they were arrested in London, which is in terms of judicial districts, is in Middlesex. And that's where I found out that the name was wrong. John Trudgett and John Deere were again indicted for stealing on the 8th of January a curricle value £30 on the property of George Steele. So the Old Bailey thinks it was only worth £30. Later on, George Steele, in that giving evidence, said he told them to sell it for £50. The interesting thing was it didn't sell at auction for that. It got passed in at auction, so it wasn't worth £50 on the day. And he kept it at Tattersall's. So apparently what happened was that you sent your, whatever it was, whether it was horses or carriages, to Tattersall's for auction. And then they kept them there if they didn't sell, so that people who came looking to buy could buy straight off instead of at auction. And you paid Tattersall's 1 shilling and 6pence a week to have your carriage stay there and be available for people to look at. The note from the Old Bailey says again indicted, and that's because they had already been indicted and tried for horse stealing. We found out about George Steele had told Trudgett, who was his overseer, to take these 2 horses off to pasture because they'd been broken down, and he sold them. And George Steele was walking down the street. In the afternoon of the 2nd of March, I was passing along Piccadilly, and at the end of Bond Street, I saw the bay horse, which I called Butcher because I had bought him of a butcher, in a hackney chariot. So that's a cab. I took particular notice of him and knew him to be my horse, the way he cocked his ear. I love the fact that he knew every horse in his stable. He's a livery stables owner, and he knew every horse in his stable as individuals. The man was driving off. I took the number of the coach, found it belonged to a Mr. Joseph Maskell. So hackney carriages had a number, just like taxis have a number, that they were licensed, and the number was 910. And so they follow that on, and they find the horses. And then they start taking, checking out what else has been stolen. And George Steele gives evidence in the curricle trial On the 20th of October, I ordered Trudgett, my head hostler, to take the curricle and 3 horses to Tattersall's at the top of Bond Street to be sold. There was a harness and all complete. The horses would not fetch the price, and they were bought in. The interesting thing, the thing that really broke my heart about this was George Steele's clear sense of enormous betrayal. He says at one point, I thought I had one of the greatest treasures of the world in Trudgett as a servant. So what happened to the 2 people, John Trudgett and John Deere? Trudgett was found guilty. Deere also found guilty. Now, interestingly, Deere was not found guilty for the horse sales because he was just doing what Trudgett told him, and Trudgett was his boss. But the curricle, he had stopped working for George Steele by the time the curricle was sold, and he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to be transported for 7 years. Now, this is from the Old Bailey records. You can see that there's no sentence imposed for Trudgett, which is spelled yet again differently. And the reason for that is that they had already been tried for stealing the horses, and Trudgett had been condemned to death. There were 220 capital offences at this point in English law. And Deere was, in fact, very lucky to get away with being transported for 7 years. I suspect that they saw Trudgett as the ringleader and Deere as a bit of a patsy, and that's why he was transported instead of hanged. Things started changing in the 1820s, 1823. It became possible for the judge to set aside the death penalty, except in important cases like murder. But Deere went off to be transported. I tried to follow his records through. There are no records of him ever arriving in Australia, which is where he would have been sent. And so 3 things are possible. One is that his sentence was commuted from transportation to jail, which did happen. Not a huge amount, but it did happen, usually because there were family issues. He could have died in the hulks, which is where transported prisoners for transport were kept, and the conditions there were absolutely appalling. Or he could have died on the journey. So I'm hoping that he was, in fact, just imprisoned for 7 years and let out. So the reason I talked about this is because the idea of curricles as a fashionable and therefore expensive item, in this case, a second-hand curricle had a value of somewhere between £30 and £50. And that was more than Trudgett would have been getting as a yearly wage. So a servant, he may have been, if he was living on premises with Steele and getting all found, as servants usually did, he would have maybe been paid £25 or £30. So the temptation is high. I thought I would look for something a bit more cheerful to end on today. And I thought I'll just check to make sure it really is as fashionable as we think, because after all, William Felton is writing just prior to the Regency in his treatise on carriages. So I went looking for fashionable people driving curricles. And I found one, indeed. I found possibly the most fashionable. This is the Egham races. And the Duke of Gloucester was throwing a party for the royal family because he was one of the stewards, although the Duchess of Gloucester was not present. The Duchess of York came in a curricle with her beautiful grey horses. So who was the Duchess of York? This is her. Her name is Frederica. She was a princess of Prussia. And she married Prince Frederick, so this man, in 1791. And everybody expected her. And I mean, can you imagine Frederick and Frederica? I mean, who thought that was a good idea? Anyway, well, we actually know, and it's their joint grandfather, because they were cousins, great-grandfather, Frederick the Great. He thought it was a great idea. And they were supposed to produce the heir because the Prince of Wales wasn't married and Frederick was the second son. And they didn't. They only lived together for 3 years. They clearly didn't like each other very much. And during that time, he was a military person, and he was off fighting Napoleon quite a lot. But the reason I thought it was worth talking to you about them is, first of all, yes, curricles were incredibly fashionable, but also this Duke of York is the grand old Duke of York who had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill, he marched them down again. And this is, like a lot of nursery rhymes, actually a political satire about a battle in which he did very badly. So what can we say about curricles? We can say that they were fashionable. We can say they were reasonably expensive for their size. We can say that you had to be quite a good whip in order to drive them safely. We can say that there were lots of accidents with curricles. But we can also say that they were being used by women on their own. So the Duchess of York is not the only woman who drove her own curricle. So say in the Grand Sophie with Treasured Hair, where people are telling Sophie she should buy a curricle instead of a high perch phaeton. It's because women do drive curricles all over the place, and gigs as well, perhaps more often. So that's This Week in the Regency in March 1816. I'm Elizabeth Leyden. I'll see you next week in the Regency.